So yes, my name's Niall Ohiggins. I work in something called the Employment Analysis Unit of the ILO. One of my major areas of focus is on young people. And in fact, the presentation today is based on analysis we've been doing of gig workers and of crowd workers, or micro-task workers, as they've been termed so far this morning. So there is a certain focus on young people, but I will also discuss some of the findings as they relate to women and some of the implications already touched upon in the introduction as regards, in particular, young people with workers with disabilities. So yeah, I will start with a little introduction on COVID-19 because it's had an enormous impact on labour markets in general, but also on youth labour markets in particular. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the results of our analyses of young people and in particular crowd work, and then draw out some of the implications covering both women and workers with disabilities. So first and foremost, I guess we all know, but just to emphasize the point, the current global recession, or the global recession precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, was actually much significantly larger, but also more broad, more widespread than the so-called global financial and economic crisis that we had just over a decade ago. And I think that's worth remembering as we move forward. This was really a huge shock to economies and hence to labour markets. If we look at the impact on workers and employment, we can see that on the left-hand side of this figure, we have young people, young women and young men, and subdivided according to high-income countries and middle-income countries. And we can see that the impact of COVID, represented by the loss of employment in 2020 compared to 2019, was much, much bigger for young people as a whole than it was for those over 25. But also it was especially pronounced for young women, and it was especially large in middle-income countries as opposed to high-income countries, where much more efforts it was possible to introduce much more measures, remedial measures to support employment and incomes. Why it was young people so hard hit has to do with both the severity of the shock. Here we have high-income countries on the left and middle-income countries on the right, and the figures show what happened over time, quarter by quarter, during the COVID pandemic. And the blue line is youth employment, the red line is adult employment, over 25 employment. And one can see that both in quarter two of 2020, young people were much harder hit, but also in terms of the recovery of youth employment has been much slower. Okay, so that's all I want to say about that, but this has implications for gig work, and I will come back to that. Essentially, the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced what was a pre-existing trend, that is a shift from long-term employment, more or less lifetime employment for many, towards more short-term task-based jobs. This is especially true for young people, and especially, but not only true in high-income countries, because of course in lower and middle-income countries, people were more subject to there was much broader informal economy anyway, which was characterized by more short-term employment in any case. But as we've already heard from Uma, the gig economy is an important and growing source of work, and as she mentioned, there's been a five-fold increase in digital labour platforms from 2020 to 2010 to 2020. And we can start to see on the right that the blue triangles represent the percentage of young people involved in gig work. We see that the young people are overrepresented, if you like, in gig work. We see this a bit more precisely here. The figure here shows, for European countries, shows the percentage of workers of different age groups who are engaged in gig work. And one can see that almost 1 in 3, nearly 30% of young people aged under 25 are engaged in gig work. Actually, they don't represent numerically the largest group, because of course, this age group, a lot of young people are still in education. So numerically, the number of workers is actually less than it is for some other groups. But in any case, it's certainly, if you're a young person, aged under 25, you're much, much more likely to be involved in some form of gig work. One of the notable features of gig work is it's very poorly paid. Gig workers earn relatively little compared to their peers, and one can see here that in these selected European countries, gig workers earn between 1/3 and not even 1/2 of the wages of workers as a whole. So there's gig work is pretty poorly paid as a whole, but not everywhere. So when we start to look at crowd work, it immediately emerges that in some countries, this is quite hard probably to see what this map is showing, but basically the greener the country, the higher the pay of crowd work compared to local wage rates. And one can see, particularly in India and South Asia, and also some parts of Northern Africa covered by the survey, that actually crowd workers earn relatively well compared to their peers who are not involved. And this is significant moving forward, but it is worth remembering that, it depends on one's perspective. In high-income countries, crowd workers and gig workers in general are very poorly paid, but in more broadly speaking, it can be relatively attractive but given the very low prevailing wage rates locally. Young people, and so we analysed young crowd workers in particular, and looked at the determinants of a number of aspects of their work. And one of the key emerging things is that young people are particularly suited to crowd work and have several advantages emerge. So young crowd workers actually earn more on an hourly basis than older crowd workers. So this is completely upturns our normal expectation of labour markets, where wages tend to increase with age. Actually, with crowd work, young workers on the whole tend to earn more than their older peers. And this is entirely due to the speed at which young people learn, and so the young people have a higher, a greater, and also a faster returns on experience. We try to show that on the right-hand side, where we see the blue line is young people again, and the red is adults, and it shows what increases with respect to experience in crowd work, how that varies between young people and adults. Yeah, young people learn more quickly, and so they're able to raise, because it's this type of job are based on task-based, and so you get paid according to the task. The faster you can do it, the more you earn. And so this faster learning process allows young people to increase their wages more quickly. So this means it's particularly attractive to young people in lower income, particularly in lower income countries, given the prevailing wages outside of graduate, so the face-to-face wages, if you like. However, one of the findings that is repeated across the variety of data sources we looked at is that the hourly earnings of young and adult women are around 20% lower than men. So young women and adult women earn less than men do, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Also, a curious thing about this is that whilst crowd workers tend to be relatively highly educated, so there's a sort of barrier for entry in terms of at least secondary school education and typically tertiary education, there are no significant returns to formal education. So having a degree doesn't actually make it any easier to earn higher wages than having a secondary degree. And that's also rather curious, because our typical expectation is that wages and incomes tend to rise with education level. So why do young women earn less? Well, it's not due to overt discrimination, simply because employers, that is the platforms and the companies using the platforms, do not know who they're hiring ex ante. So there's no way to implement any kind of ex ante discrimination saying, oh, yeah, we'd rather have men doing the job or whatever. Rather, this is due, the difference in wages, and we've gone into this quite carefully, is due to additional outside constraints on young women's participation in the labour market. And in fact, we find that actually young women who don't have children do not earn less than men. So it's the presence of children in this case. So the constraints that some young women and also adult women, but some young women are faced with in the presence of children, limiting the types of work they could otherwise do outside of crowd work. And this hints at something, maybe at least a potential a benefit or something that could be developed to enhance the working lives of young women. Also, in part, the lower wages of young women are due to gender discrimination in local labour markets, so face-to-face local labour markets, because these will lower the alternative earnings available to women, and so make them more willing to participate in gig work, even though the returns to them are slightly less. Clearly, young people, especially in lower income countries, are drawn to crowd work by the pay. So when asked why do you do crowd work, young people were more likely, although still not a huge number, but young people were more likely to say that they're attracted to crowd work because the pay is better than the alternative jobs. This is particularly true for young people. It's particularly true for people in lower middle income countries, and this is fairly natural given the lower prevailing relative wages, even though, as Uma pointed out, crowd workers in lower middle income countries earn much less than they do in high income countries. So let me just turn to some implications and conclusions. So essentially, the key points here is that gig and platform work present significant challenges. And we've heard many of these already, but perhaps just I'll go over these briefly, but also some opportunities, but they won't just appear by themselves. One needs appropriate regulation, and I think this has already, in fact, been something of the theme running through the presentation so far. So there are basic issues of job quality, job employment, and income security associated. The gig work is by its nature tends to be very short term, and the payment is according to specific tasks, and it's and very often the tendency of employers is to seek to actually engage gig workers as self-employed, and this is an issue of some concern in the ILO, and I think more generally, and it has there are clearly some issues there. So as we see, what work is poorly paid, and as Uma pointed out, the access to recourse it can be very problematic when problems arise. There are also issues regarding to access to social protection, also access to occupational safety and health, because typically gig workers are self-employed. And there's also another point that Uma made very nicely, that states the difficulty in validating experience. So how do you build on your experience? So as we saw, young people in particular, but also older workers, gain from experience. They're able to earn more. They get better because they get better at doing the tasks. But how do you validate that? If you move to another platform, you have no way of transferring that. You can't get a reference from your employer, and there are some issues with that in terms of validating the experience. Second point I wanted to make is that it is really a question. I mean, this is what we're looking at now. To what extent, and was raised by the chair in the introduction, to what extent is this form of work a driver in inequality, and in this case, particularly within youth labour markets? I mean, there is an issue here of which young people have access, as I mentioned. it's reasonably well-educated young people who typically can access groundwork type jobs, and there are typically these type of barriers. And the quality, what we're seeing now as we move forward with our analysis, is that more generally in these types of gig work, the quality of work varies greatly, and it has a lot to do with educational attainment. So education can clearly act as a driver of inequality. However, the jury is still out on that particular issue, and in particular how to improve upon that situation. But there is, in what I've presented so far, an area of possibility. So I mentioned that one of the reasons that women, and young women in particular, earn less is because this is a type of work that is attractive to young women for young women facing specific constraints, such as having small children. And this suggests that this type of work may offer, or it does offer, sort of flexibility to those who are restricted in their working hours, when they can go, because these are flexible according to one can organize one's working life according to around other involvement. But more generally, it reduces some of the restrictions in the more normal, let's say, face-to-face type of work. And this would also be applicable to workers with disability. I mean, electronic means and computer access so may, for some at least, offer possibilities to do work that they would otherwise face greater obstacles in doing. And clearly the relatively low pay rates of women suggest that this has not been resolved in a sufficient way, but it does suggest that there may be a way forward in terms of appropriately regulating and appropriately supporting these types of work to actually be a means to access decent work. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.